Mm.
Because I think pretty much we're alive. It's doing things, doing stuff.
It's doing
Uh,
stuff.
it's doing stuff. Maybe it's doing all the things. Um, you know, maybe this is what we're supposed to be doing today, doing the work. Um, at some point or another, we'll actually have recognition of our life status. When I check all the places, I think it's good. I think we're bouncing across all the satellites at this point because it says that on the internets. We're doing that now. So Terry, how are you doing as we get ready to do the work here at the top of the hour?
I'm doing.
You're
That's
doing
not the
something.
answer today. I've been
You're
up a
doing
long
something.
time, so I'm
Yeah.
doing something.
Terry's about ready to do the nap. I think that's
I'm about ready to do the nap.
yeah.
I've it's been a long day already. 3:30 came
Uh,
early.
it's interesting. I will not specify the individual evangelist, but I will clarify that it is not me. Um, Nor is this person a slacker because they're a very hard worker. But there's an evangelist I know of that likes to get up super early in the morning and go and get his work in. Usually 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, he'll be in the building doing his work. And he used to keep a cot in his office for the mid morning nap that would take place, and then he would pop back to work, and work some in the afternoon. Um, there's a little bit of me that kind of wishes that I had a little hammock sliding behind me. Because
Wait, time out. You work at your house. There's a hammock in the backyard. We all know this. Like, it's not like you have to get in the car to go find a hammock spot. Like, come on.
no, I can walk out to the trees and do that too. I just like variation, different scenery, different sights. Although to be
You
fair,
would trade a hammock outside for a hammock in your office. I don't
some
believe
days,
you.
some days there are some days. Having had both, there are benefits to both. There are benefits to
Okay.
both. Um, so you got to have some variation there. Although maybe I would treat a door for a hammock at this point. Still, that's probably something I'm still
Because there's a
contemplating.
couch, but there's a couch behind you. I mean, you could squeeze that 6'7" frame on that couch back there.
Barely. It really don't
Yeah.
fit there.
By the way, the
Uh,
rumor is that one of the great reveals at FC is the lectures this year was, "Wow, Phil, you're taller than I imagined."
It was quite surprising. I've never really not accepted the reality that I hit my head on everything. And so it was just a bit of an uncomfortable surprise when everyone assumed that I was, smaller than average. Because I consider myself average height at this point in life. Everyone's smaller than me.
I'm 6'4", and I have to look up to you. But we both have that feeling. We walk into a house that we turn our head this way to get under the ceiling fan. That's
Yes, I've hit many of things over the years. That's probably more explanatory than it should be.
ceiling
Um,
fans with drop down bars and then the big light fixtures in the middle of a room. Very deadly to tall guys. Very
yeah,
deadly.
moving dining room tables is a dangerous
Yes.
experience.
Yeah, in our kitchen, sometimes the table gets a little off center from the big heavy chandelier. This head has hit that a lot. It's not comfortable.
Yeah. So for today, kind of lay some things out, we're going to be discussing a little bit of a reflection on the rebuilt temple in Ezra and Nehemiah and trying to um, put it in the context of evangelistic work, put it in the context of leadership, and put it in the context of teaching and preaching. Um, Old Testament texts are great for that. They exist in the space of Romans chapter 15, verse 4. They were written for our learning. Remember that learning is focused specifically on building hope in context. And so those are some of the things that, are appealed to, but not always considered at times. We'll get that in a second. I do have one question for Terry. People know what I did for my day off from due to the work. I was apparently a monkey in the circus, and people could say, "Look how tall he is." Terry, what'd you do on your day off from the
Uh,
work, if you will?
I did the work. I was right here doing work. I mean,
Yeah,
it's not like I just had a free day.
yeah,
Um,
free day.
yeah. So I had more time to do the work. How about that? That's what
Yeah,
happened.
yeah. Not surprising.
Yeah.
It's a simple reality. Well, let's get into it a little bit. And Terry, this is, I'll say surprisingly, but it's not really surprisingly, a subject that came from Terry's perspective. And so, Terry, you get the privilege and joy to walk us into what you were thinking about when you presented this idea in our idea chat.
Well, look in Ezra 3, you have the temple foundation has been built, and when that happens, there's this response of praise, giving thanks, and you have one generation that is praising God for this foundation. You have an older generation, though, who sees this foundation and remembers what the temple used to be and how this, quite frankly, is just not going to compare. And as a result of that, they weep, they mourn. And it's always interesting to me. Now, later on in Ezra 6, when the temple's completed, everybody praises, and that's a good thing. But here, it's interesting to just see this idea that the same situation could be so diverse in the response that it receives. And yet, I think that's one of the interesting things about when you think about that we still have that go on today. A good example of that would be the issue of mask indoors, and churches that moved indoors, masks were optional, which means in a lot of places masks were not present. You have a lot of people who are just really rejoicing that overall, and then you had some people who wouldn't come, who mourned because of a different response. The challenge in all of that, Phil, is as Christians, as a congregation, and really as leadership, how to navigate all those waters sometimes is really difficult. How to rejoice with one and weep with the other at the same time can be a difficult balancing act.
Yeah, this is something that's challenging, I think, in particular for preachers at different points in our lives, because different subjects will rise to prominence on the basis of where we are in our personal journey, through our age, through our experience, through our education, through our service. And as much as we don't want to accept it, preachers actually have an expectation of keeping some of their opinions to themselves and how they feel about something, rather than issues of this is a matter of biblical import, this is a matter of spiritual formation, this is a matter of character, and that happens in leadership contexts outside of preaching all the time, where like your opinion may be wildly different than what is best for the group, but people are looking at you to see how you respond to these areas of judgment and say, well, let's gauge everything by how the preacher responds, rather than going and saying, hey, let me think about this for what's best for the group, which the preacher probably has already gone through those processes of acceptance, consideration, how am I going to move forward with this? And that's an aspect of preaching that is not necessarily even laid out in any kind of specific in the text. It's a general principle of communal fellowship where you make decisions to work together, and that means you might at times submit yourself in different ways and accept the outcome. But we're people. We're humans. Well, and we have feelings.
Yeah, we're supposed to be peacemakers, and that's really where the burden comes. If I'm not careful, my response can sway one way or the other, and then I'm not a peacemaker in the sense that I should be, and I'm not building up for peace, the congregation. And so then the problem becomes, and you've been in that situation, if you're not with me, then not only are you not with me, but you're judging me, kind of thing. And so it's a difficult thing. And let me toss this in there, that I'm sometimes also confused by what excites us and what we emotionally react to. I think that's part of this discussion as well. Like, I've been most congregations that I'm a part of at some point become a little bit more responsive to preaching, which is what I love. There's amens, there's interaction. And then I'll go somewhere, and you've had this, I know, Phil, where you go somewhere, and the other thing that happens is if I say something funny, I expect you to respond to funny. Okay? And I don't
Yeah.
interject funny just to be a comedian. I mean, sometimes a story's just funny and it makes a point. And you should respond to that appropriately. It shouldn't be out of hand, but you should respond. So, your home congregation gets used to your style and your expectations. But then you go travel and you go to one of these places where they're not allowed to respond and interact at all with the speakers up there, and those places exist, and they don't amen, they don't respond, they don't respond to even something that is funny. They don't laugh, they just sit there. So there's like this absence of emotion, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I think that's a wrong approach. And the other time that I've seen that is we've all seen when somebody's baptized and like nobody knows what to do. There's no response. There's nothing. Just dead silence. I'm not sure we could have multiple debates about what is appropriate. And you're a friend of mine on Facebook. You've seen that debate for the last couple of days. But that aside, I'm not sure that just sitting there like nothing happened is an appropriate response to all of that. So, just like I said, I think it's interesting to see what we do respond to, what we don't respond to. And I think especially the baptism, when people don't respond with joy, but then you see how joyous they are over not having to wear a mask or those kind of things. I think all of that's pretty interesting just to see what gets us happy and what we just sit there and we don't respond to at all. So anyway, I think, a lot of this is just this idea of our response, but the bigger picture that we're talking about is, what do we do about all of that? And that's the bigger issue, I guess.
Yeah, there's natural tendencies that come into that. Naturally speaking, like my own emotive response, I'm not a clapper at events. I don't necessarily cheer loudly unless it's really contextual. I'm a fist pumper. I'm a yes, kind of. That's my emotive response in that regard. And so when you think about it in the terms of our context here, leadership, context of evangelism, context of growing faith, these become important questions because in many ways, a sermon is in part persuading emotion with logos and with pathos and with the ethos of the ideas. We're persuading across each of those concepts. And Shane's kind of pointed something in the context of like rejoice when resurrection takes place. My preference, this is my leadership expectation, my personal preference, is when someone faces breaks the water and they're coming forth as a new being, I want the first thing they hear is rejoicing. And if we can sing at that moment, that's the best option for me. Like I want them to hear a song. I want them to hear the rejoicing of their brethren. I want the song to be something that's contextually in that emotive space. And I think that's great. And from a leadership standpoint, that's my best option. Now, Terry pointed out something rational that's important, that a lot of times we adopt that practice to suppress other practices. Not all the time, but that's a suppression approach that says, hey, we don't want the rejoicing to be this way. We want it to be that way. Now, my rationale for that is partially theological. I want singing because I think singing is a great attribute in our worship. I want singing because it will reinforce those good things. But it's important to point out that that's not the only form of rejoicing in the Old and New Testament. Rejoicing takes place across a lot of contexts. And it's important for us who lead to realize something. The person who is really upset by a thing, and we'll go back to a context of masking, unmasking, probably is demonstrating the deepest part of their emotions for other reasons at that moment when they rejoice or are upset. They're not actually upset per se about the mask A or B. They're probably upset or rejoicing for a series of things. And leadership then needs to make sure that if I'm going to push forward in a corner, I don't push other people out of the way. That I actually lead them somewhere with my behavior, with my choices, with my demonstration of the joy that's within me. And so if we again go back to that context of Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilt temple, which is the middle temple, if you will. It's not exactly, it changes when we get to Jesus, because that's the expanded temple that's been built on and lots of extra garden space outside of it. It was quite less. And yet, for the most part, only a small segment was feeling this negative emotion, because only a small segment had any real recognition of what it used to be like.
Right.
And so I think that's an important factor to bring into is only a small segment is often the ones that are most moved one way or the other in these kind of high stakes emotional settings. And your sermons, your preaching, your teaching, your leadership can either put salve on the wounds of pain, or it can rip the bandage off. And that's an important thing to think about, like the message you preach, the song that you select, the class that's next. It is really going to be an important aspect of how are we going to approach our leadership role, our evangelistic role, our teaching role. And so, I just think it's super important to kind of be cautious in those things. And remember where your expertise lies. Preachers and teachers, that's where your expertise lies. You're not public policy experts. You're not scientists. You're not medical professionals. You rely on those individuals to give you quality information. And so, just like you do with a commentary, be a discerning reader so that you can become a discerning leader.
And the singing of the song is great. And we sang a song. It was a little delayed because whoever was leading singing that day wasn't prepared. Yeah. And so actually a different song leader got up. I will say, even if there had been a song ready to go in this particular example we're talking about, as I told you earlier, you probably wouldn't have heard the first couple of measures, because I don't think you could have stopped what happened. And there was a lot that went on. Here's the overall thing in regards to that specifically. And we started talking about this subject well before that occurred, by the way, for people to know. This was actually a topic of consideration before that event. What you need to know is that I think one of the things that came from that is that you have to be very careful of restricting people's joyous response. And I think that's one of the things that I think as a leader that comes to my mind is I don't want us to. There's a difference between when I was in an internship and the subject of emotions came up. Wilson Adams, who trained me, and I were talking about the emotions he compared to a dog in an illustration. And some people let their dog run all over the neighborhood. There's no boundaries. Some people put a fence up, but what some people do is they just tie the dog's neck directly to the tree, like just a foot away, and the dog's not allowed to do anything.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid sometimes if emotions is our dog, we're so afraid of it running the neighborhood that we tie it right to the tree so it can't do anything. And so from that standpoint, I think there has to be a balance, and I think that we need to be cautious and we need to be respectful of how we rejoice. We also need to be respectful of how we respond to other people rejoicing. And the bigger issue, is not only that, but then Phil, just dealing with all of those emotions. I think that's one of the things about this last year that's been really difficult for me to navigate is the bucket of emotions that have been expressed from everybody. And you take any issue, and I think you and I talked about this, and it's the widest response of emotions I've ever experienced. It's just amazing how that is. And you talk about evangelism. I don't think we realize how emotions really impact our evangelism.
Yeah.
When you're excited, when you're genuinely excited about things in your faith, in your relationship with God, in your relationship with other Christians, you are more evangelistic when you are more rejoicing. When you're discouraged at church, when you're frustrated with things, you're not evangelistic at all a lot of times, because why would you want to bring anybody into that? So this subject of emotions is a big deal.
Here's another way to kind of think through this process of like, how are we going to approach this again from the idea of how do we lead. If you imagine a circle with a hedge that goes around it, the hedge is self-defined. We've built that hedge, and we say our behavior, our actions, our emotions have to live within that hedge. But God has said that the hedge actually is my word and my will. And that's what needs to be happening. What we are doing is we are limiting ourselves from fully developing in the areas that God wants us to be within. We've actually diminished the potential for spiritual transformation. And Kenny, go ahead, steal away. But I am going to do an important thing with that, which is to put that up there to clarify the origin for all time of however that's used. But here's the thing to think about. In that space between your hedge and God's hedge, there are two things that are super important that I think are important to kind of lay out. Number one, there's something in there that God needs you to be involved with. Maybe it's in the area of evangelism, someone you wouldn't see because you won't go to the place that they are, wherever that is. Maybe it's not something where you reach out to something. Maybe it's something in your character, in your understanding, in your development that you need to have in order to be complete and to be mature. But you've made a hedge that says, no, I won't go there, even though I know that God's space gives a different definition to that. Now, let me add the other important qualifying point to that. As you get closer to the boundaries that God has said and God has stated, it doesn't mean you just run blindly to the wall and bounce off the edge. It means you exercise the same kind of caution that God himself exercises in the way that he deals with us. You give warning, you give admonition, and you create a zone that says, hey, the closer I get to the boundaries of God's word, I'm going to be more attentive of that boundary. I'm going to be more careful. But it doesn't mean I don't go there. It just means I'm aware. And then Bob points out something important too, and this comes into the contrast I noted earlier. What may look like suppressed emotion to someone might be another's best effort at their understanding of reverence. And that probably impacts that balance space. Because a person is by nature, demure, quiet, respectful in an event, as we might define those ideas, doesn't mean they don't rejoice. They're fighting against balanced parts of their development that says, hey, this is a really important thing. And here's the example that is comparative. The Lord's Supper is a remembrance of, primarily in our minds at times, the sacrifice of Jesus. But the sacrifice of Jesus, his blood on the cross, leads to our rejoicing. Very often we equate the Lord's Supper to the idea of a funeral. And you said, would anyone clap at a funeral? And of course, for the most answer, except for the most urbane or calloused hearts who are happy that someone is dead, no one claps at funerals. And yet, we would rejoice at the resurrection that is to come for them. And so those kind of things are part of the balance that takes place in all of our worship. Like, how much is too much? Individuals' comfort zone may be in a different place than mine. Again, like I said, I'm a fist pumper, and that's like my thing. That's how I would express it, where someone else might hoop and holler and clap. Awesome. I understand the difference. But my leadership approach is singing is the theologically best answer because it satisfies a lot of the bigger picture of the Bible. But I recognize that, hey, there's a boundary that might be further than that because of the rest of the teaching of the New Testament and Old Testament.
Yeah, I think one of the things to point out is that in the instance I'm talking about, I did not clap. I think that's one of the interesting things. I actually said, praise the Lord, and then we sang. And that is my typical response. I think that the thing that was an area of growth for me is what you just said. Understanding that even though I personally have this boundary of what I'm comfortable with, there may be a broader boundary that God is comfortable with. And I need to be very cautious about my response. So I agree with Bob. There needs to be a respect to both ways. One of the challenges here is that, especially when you view something as a form of reverence, it is very easy, if you're not careful, to be very judgmental to anybody who doesn't agree because reverence is a more restrictive. It's kind of like that idea of the political spectrum, for instance, or from left to right. It's easier to agree if the guy to the left of me will submit in agreement to me. Like, it's easier for us to get along. Because in that conservative liberal thing, I'm more conservative. So he'll just come to my side. It's easier, I'll do it this way. I'll just use a really silly explanation. If you and I are color and photo, and you got a 16 color box of crayon and I got an 8 color box of crayons, if you'll only use the 8, then we could get along. But if you use the other 8, then I can't add to mine. So from that standpoint, there's this idea of kind of moving towards each other. The only problem with that is if I'm always expecting the guy to the left to move to me, especially when, hey, look, there's just some of these things, and I know that my life, the way I have grown up, the way that I've gone, that I'm going to be more conservative in some areas, but I got to be understanding of people who aren't where I'm at. That doesn't mean, by the way, that I get, before anybody talks about like we're applying this to doctrine. That's not what we're talking about. And some of these things, by the way, that I have even myself bound as doctrine, I think we need to really question whether they are.
And understand that asking a question doesn't mean abandoning an idea. It means asking a question and reaffirming, or perhaps even developing a better way to express or explain why you hold the conviction that you hold. One of the most challenging parts of maturing your faith is making it your faith. This is my belief, my convictions, and this is how I express them. It's challenging because no matter where we are and who we worship with and who we listen to, we tend to pick up their methodology, whether it's in leadership, whether it is in the way we preach, the way we teach, and what we believe. And we've got to make it a point to say there's a segment where it says, this is no longer, how can I understand unless someone guides me? If I guide, I should have a good way of explaining why I believe what I believe. And that comes fundamentally from asking questions. Okay, now, why do I hold to this conviction? To put it in Terry's illustration, there are times when you look to the person who has 16 crayons and we only have 8, and ask them, hey, teach me about the colors you have on your palette. I know I'm primary and secondary color, but I want to know about chartreuse. And I want to know more than magenta and teal. And tell me about how these colors work together.
By the way, you jumped to the 64 box because anybody that's had the 16 knows there's no chartreuse or teal or magenta in the 8 or 16. So that just tells me that you grew up in a different demographic than I did. You were spoiled as a young kid. I got the 10-cent box of crayons, and you were getting the $1.25 box back then.
More specifically, my mom was an artist, and so I grew up in the world that had all the colors all the time.
You didn't have crayons; you had pastels.
We had pastels.
Yeah. And look, I think one of the things about this is that just, and to go back to the real idea, because we kind of got a little sidetracked off of the response to baptism and all that. The real thing is that as leadership, you've got to be really careful how you navigate these waters, that you're going to have people who rejoice in different ways. And you may have situations like COVID, and I know, Phil, as a shepherd, you've dealt with this, where you have people that rejoice and other people are not rejoicing at all. Like and responding in a way that provides balance and stability in the face of those emotions is important. And I think one of the things to point out, I think that the last resort is to criticize them for their emotional response. I think, in fact, in most cases, telling them not to rejoice or not to weep is just unwise. Because when you tell them not to feel, and you strip that away from them, you're really ripping layers of devotion to God and to God's people away when you tell them they're not allowed to emotionally respond. That's the end result of that. And so, as leaders, as we said earlier, I mean, if we're trying to provide peace, sometimes we're going to restrict our emotional responses.
Yeah.
Sometimes we may feel comfortable doing something, but we won't do it because we're going to keep ourselves in the middle. And I think that's one of the more interesting things. And so you take the singing of the song. I think that's probably a great practice. But if you're doing that and people respond with something else, then that becomes an issue at that time.
Yeah, and Bob's question is complicated. His question is, could we encourage them to feel less publicly? And I'll just put it this way: we do that all the time. We do that with children in mentoring them for what's appropriate behavior when they feel upset, when they feel hurt. We encourage them to redirect those things and to process them better. And so on the negative emotional side, we do that a lot. Like, hey, is your response equivalent to your hurt? Are you overreacting in that way? So we know that there is a moderation on one side. There is also the need to moderate on the other side. Where, hey, is this the appropriate amount of reaction for the thing that you're experiencing? Are you potentially creating a circumstance where you are basically tossed to and fro by your emotions, where it's all wide open? And so, yes, we need to learn to, by process of teaching, by process of mentoring, by process of example, say, hey, there actually are some moderating responses. We're like, that's not really like the right time for this.
And look, so like applause. Let me say this: I think there could be context where that would really bother me, and I would probably talk to people about that. Yeah. I'm just going to tell you that what happened recently is I would not do that. If it was because my sermon was so great, then I will publicly criticize them for that, because that's applauding the presenter, I feel, more than the message. And here's my issue with encouraging people to feel less publicly, and I'm going to apply this specifically to the historical tradition of the Church of Christ I grew up in. Let me say it that way. If it's like most places that I've been a member of for most of my life, that's already been done. I got to tell you that if you've ever visited around to other groups, sometimes, and I'm not saying we need to go too far, okay? Please understand. But sometimes we just feel really dead in comparison to other people when they're worshiping God. And look, and I'm talking specifically when we get up and sing and Be Happy like a funeral march, and we've all heard that happen, and those kind of things. One of the thing is that the feeling part, we need to be careful not to do that. Now, Bob qualifies that in the pro or anti-mask. And I would say yes, because that goes back to what I said earlier about context. Emotions on pro or anti-mask is not a spiritual response. And I think that would be inappropriate publicly in the worship setting, right? And we've not had that issue publicly. That's more of a personal, private, individual response. But if that were to happen publicly, like the elders get up and say, hey, we don't have to wear masks anymore, and applause broke out, I would feel that would be inappropriate because it's not an emotional response. And so I think, again, that goes back to leadership. I guess what I'm saying about that, Bob, just to address you specifically, is as far as a spiritual emotional response, I think we need to actually encourage that a little more sometimes. I think, by the way, it's sad to me. Have you ever, maybe Phil, you've not felt this way, but you ever watch like a choir sing on TV that's really emotionally into it? Or you are at let's say a different cultural congregation, like I'll just say a black church, and their singing's more emotional. There's a lot of amens and interaction, and you go, man, I could get used to that, right? I think if you've ever tasted that, there's a balance there, but we could sometimes use a little more of that in our groups than saying feel less. And that's again one of the issues here is asking people to feel less on spiritual things, I think is works against what we're trying to accomplish. It damages our edification. It damages our evangelism. It damages the way we view the gospel. If you look in the Bible about the way that people respond to the Lord, their responses of rejoicing are usually loud. They are usually sometimes their body is involved. That would make us really uncomfortable, by the way. There's a lot of those kind of responses.
Well, you already make me uncomfortable anyway.
Yeah, in the Old and New Testament, right? I mean,
yeah.
You think about the parable of the prodigal son. Whatever they were doing to rejoice that son coming home, the older one could hear it outside the back door. I mean, that's not the quiet, somber occasion that some places have when somebody returns to the Lord. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think we need to do that. And at the same time, we've got to be cautious and lead by example and not be too much where, you're up running around the room and hopping over pews and chairs and screaming and those kind of things.
That's just an emotional trip to the ER for me.
That's an emotional response some people have. Yeah. I've tried to hop over a pew before and it didn't go well. I landed on the one in front of it.
So let me kind of connect a couple dots here. Bob was talking really specifically in the pro or anti-mask context. I'll make two areas of illustration. I have some friends who I know feel very deeply that the various local, communal, state, and federal expectations for wearing some sort of face covering is an infringement on their individual rights, both as a citizen of the United States and at times an impingement upon their practice of religion. I try very intentionally to not participate in forceful dialogues about that because I understand that that's a very strong issue for them. I try not to be a negative participant in conversations, particularly on social media, about that because I think it reflects poorly on what my personal goals are for an evangelist. I also try very hard not to negatively view them because they feel more strongly about that, where I am intentionally training myself to care less about partisan politics when I used to really care about it a lot. This is an intentional personal choice. And so that's a challenge to submit my feelings to discipline when I want to go just and say any number of things. I almost fell into my own trap right there.
You did. You almost went and said those number of things.
I just trapped myself because I think that's a challenge that's independent of an individual issue like this one. You replace it with any number of ones. You go back to 200, 300 AD, and you could find individuals who struggle with this same issue. They struggled with, do we pay our tax? And the general tenor of all the martyrs that they are recognized from 100 to 300 AD, they paid the tax, but they would not renounce their Lord. And so that's my goal, is to fit into that moral, spiritual space, is to pay the tax, but not renounce my Lord. It's what Daniel seems to have strived to do in Babylon. It's what his ill-named three buddies who seem to have been shackled with their Babylonian names, Babylonian U, and kind of kept when we forgot that Mishael and I actually had their own Hebrew names. And so that's part of that goal that we're kind of aiming for. And again, on social media, and this is really important for preachers and teachers who have influence, no matter what the policy is for the entity where you labor, whether it's a local church or somewhere else, what you say is going to be snapshotted by somebody, and it's going to be either kept as the general position for the group or used against you in some way in the future. And so realize that, hey, this stuff actually does matter a little bit more than you may think it does, because your influence matters. Like, part of the influence of teaching and preaching is really whom you are. They're going to listen to you not just because you care, but because you have character that cares about them.
Well, and so, like, personally, I've had this issue where I'm anti major parties, right? But my response was that that became my politics, and then that through social media especially, became my hobby horse. Now my hobby horse, by the way, to pick up what Bob McPherson was putting down earlier,
Hibachi.
is hibachi. Yeah, which is not hibachi. It's just flat top grilling. Which, by the way, is far less divisive, right? Like, who's going to bring up, except unless they're just coveting, and then we have a whole other issue. But again, Bob, I understand where you're going with that, and reiterate everything Phil said. Part of that just gets back to when we're talking about the emotions that are appropriate in the context of our worship and our assembly. We need those spiritual emotional responses. We need those. And it's sad that a lot of people are more interested in the response emotionally to all these other earthly carnal things that have no place in our assembly than they are to the things in the assembly. That's the thing that I think is troubling.
I'm calling my shot for next week. This is our topic for next week.
Bad taste in sermons?
Yes. Shane didn't mean it in any way around this.
Are we going to use examples?
I hope so.
Wow.
I hope so.
I'm going to take down our website between now and next Tuesday, so we can't do
that. I say that because as we're kind of closing out for today, this is kind of the ending range of our conversation. And Komodo grilling is fine, Kenny. I prefer to smoke things on the pellet smoker these days. And I keep eyeballing full-blown trailer stick smokers when they pop up on Facebook Marketplace, because I'm pretty sure that at least in my county, I could be a competitor in brisket. I think I could probably go toe-to-toe with any of the brisket I've had in the county. Pork, different thing. The other stuff, different thing. But brisket, I think, is my jam.
I got your pork. I'm your pork boy over here. I'm the pig boy.
Yeah.
My 11 years in Memphis qualifies me. I'm the pork king over here. Let's just go with that.
Right. But let's just think about it this way as we kind of close out and shift. Your role as an evangelist and a teacher, as a leadership component to local church, includes learning to navigate this difficult area of judgment of when something takes place. Am I clinging to the memory of a forgotten time, or am I rejoicing for the good that this has provided? There is no doubt that, back to our primary little textual allusion in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, that the temple that they built was structurally less in the eyes of men than it was before. But that temple, though expanded upon, was fundamentally different than the one that David planned for, Solomon built, and then Solomon built a bigger palace next to it. Because the temple that was built that day is the temple where God in the flesh walked. And so that there should help us shift our understanding and realize that their emotions were real and genuine and valuable, but they just didn't see enough in the future to realize that it was the foundation for something better. Such is the case with things where we learn, like right now, that are hard lessons, difficult lessons, but they very may well be the foundation for something better that is to come. And Terry pointed out earlier, and this is my tie into that, statistically speaking, I can say this with a high level of confidence, that most of the brethren that Terry and I know in the United States have probably never worshiped in a truly integrated or in a group that is demographically not like them. And I'm talking specifically Black, Asian, Latin America, South America, etc. Like, the math tells me that this is true. It just is. When you do, you will change. And you will wonder, how good will it be in 20 years if perhaps my children don't have the memory that I do? And the only thing that they know is groups that have figured out the joy of worshiping with people who are fundamentally culturally different from one another and yet tied together in Christ.
By the way, just real quick, a group I worked with had 4 families come in from a very culturally different congregation than what we were. And part of that was continual response to the preaching. And when they came in, even though they were a very small percentage, there's over 200 of the people who didn't do that. There was only about 20 of them, okay? They kept that practice. and it bothered some people. But you know what happened a couple of years later? Other people were doing the same thing, and it was a beautiful thing. And as you said, I have children that don't remember worshiping somewhere where that didn't happen in some format. They don't remember sermons without amens. They don't remember prayers without amens at the end. And that's a good thing. And so hopefully as we continue to grow in the areas of balance and rightfully using our emotions, like you said, the next generation won't remember. They won't mourn over the things they don't know. And that will be good.
Yep. Just maybe 5 or 6 months ago, the song leader finished leading the songs, and we were passing each other in the crossing of he was coming down and I was going up. And Norris Robinson leans over to me and whispers, and he goes, "Get it." And I got to tell you, that may not have been the best sermon I've preached, but I felt like I was going to preach the best sermon that I could preach.
See, the difference is if that had been me and you, I'd have led like a really, really good song. I'd got them all pumped up, and I'd be like, "Top that."
Yeah, I know. And I'm like, I would respond with, "Too easy."
Yeah.
Too easy. That's just too easy. Hey, we'll be back next week. We're going to talk about poor taste in sermons. And we may expose
Shane Scott, guest speaker.
Shane will be joining us in one form or another. Either he will be personally to defend himself. He doesn't know this yet, or we might just go through those old sermons. I see this in part, though. I did an audit of my prior sermons. I put all of my old sermons titles into Logos. So I can now see all of the things I did and when I preached them and where I preached them in their sermon manager thing. And it just confirmed my prior opinion that a lot of it was bad.
By the way, speaking of Shane Scott, any truth to the rumor that while you were at his house last week, you tried to rearrange his library?
That would have done no good. I looked at it. I contemplated it. The one thing
you sent me pictures of it. You sent me pictures of it and said something to the degree of, Shane, just in case you didn't know, it's worse than it looks.
I had to moderate my behavior to the point of he has his YouTube into his Apple TV, and I really wanted to go in there and subscribe him to a lot of different channels to mess with his algorithm, so he would start seeing like lawn talk and dad shoe stuff and all the outdoors things like a possible.
Because all it was barbershop talk. Yeah. That's all it was.
Barbershop and weird sermons.
Poor taste in weird sermons, which will be next week. Circling back.
Yeah, circling back. All right, everyone. Y'all have a great day. May the Lord bless you in your work and your endeavors. And if Terry and I can help, we'll make Shane do it.